Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray. I'm going to answer a question today about Hellenistic cavalry. But before we do, of course, you can ask us a question too. Send us an email, send us a letter, send us a postcard, send us a message, comment on a previous video. We'll get that question. You can, of course, back us on Patreon /Ancient Warfare podcast and ask a question of your own to get your weekly 10-minute Ancient Warfare fix, which is what you are about to get now. So the question we are being asked today is the supposed decline in the quality of Hellenistic cavalry true, or is that an exaggeration, with Hellenistic cavalry remaining elite well into the conquest of said Hellenistic kingdoms by the Romans? The Hellenistic cavalry eliteness is something that we find in the armies of Alexander the Great. Obviously, he's a cavalry commander as opposed to an infantry commander. And I think we've spoken before about the fact that he sets up the example and the parameters of Hellenistic kings being cavalry commanders like Alexander, leading charges from the front and things like that. Now, I think we've also spoken about the fact that Alexander's cavalry victories are very specific setups. In brief, his cavalry advance to the right, that maneuver is mimicked and matched by the enemy on their left. The phalanx stays in the center. At some point, that movement to the right by Alexander and the mirroring of it by the enemy, the Persians mostly, creates a gap or a weakening in the left flank of their line. Alexander then shifts and charges that weakening point and breaks through. So, and you can see that at the Battle of the Granicus, if you follow Diodorus's account, not if you follow Arrian or Plutarch's account. You can see it at the Battle of Issus, and you can see it at the Battle of Gaugamela. Now, you don't get that specific set of circumstances in battles which follow in the Hellenistic and then in the conflict between the Hellenistic and the Romans. And so, in a way, what Alexander did to make his cavalry elite isn't followed by the later generals. They don't seem to learn that lesson or observe that lesson. And so the cavalry charging solid infantry will never work and doesn't. And so what you find is the elite nature of Hellenistic cavalry is kind of nullified by the fact that they are not used on the battlefield in the same circumstances or to take advantage of the same created weakness that Alexander's are. And so they may well have stayed as high quality as they had always been. They certainly remain the high status, elite, aristocratic pursuit. And so you get a lot of that attitude retained in ancient Macedonian and Hellenistic warfare. But I think the problem is that they're not used in the same way. They're not used with the same insight, and they're not used with the same tactics. So in many ways, they are blunted, literally. You do, however, get the rise of horse archers and the rise of other missile cavalry and cavalry that can harass and pursue fleeing enemies. And so, in a way, that is what cavalry become in Roman warfare. Each legion has 120 cavalry. Roman cavalry absolutely get lambasted as being inferior in quality. But when they start to adopt other forms of cavalry, generally speaking, it's missile cavalry and light cavalry from other nations, which are not designed for heavy cavalry charges the way Alexander used his. But again, they needed to be used in very specific circumstances, which don't often get caused on the battlefield. In many, many ways, the misuse of Roman cavalry and the misuse of Hellenistic cavalry lead to their not being as effective on the battlefield as they were under Alexander. But they are still good cavalry. And you can see that in the cavalry used by Hannibal against the Roman cavalry, that his cavalry is superior to Roman cavalry. The other shift, of course, that happens in Hellenistic warfare and then also in conflict with Roman armies later is that the shift moves towards the phalanx itself. And there seems to be an ancient Hellenistic arms race where the phalanxes of Hellenistic armies get bigger and bigger because they're trying to out-phalanx one another. not necessarily out-cavalry one another. But the other thing, of course, is they are also trying to out-elephant and out other forms of scythe chariots and all these other strange and unusual weapons to try and get an edge. But what it starts to become is a stagnation of its very same. No one's trying to look for a tactical edge. They're trying to look for a numerical edge, which is interesting because we've got that paralleled now in the 20th century and the 21st century. It's not about the quality of the weapon. It's just having more of them. And if someone gets a better quality weapon, the enemy soon copy that better quality weapon. And again, it becomes a matter of numbers. But what you find, therefore, is when the Macedonian and Hellenistic armies come into conflict with the Romans, the Roman legion brings a different attitude to infantry warfare than the Macedonian phalanx. So the Macedonian phalanx is a massive formation. Alexander's phalanx never exceeds sort of 9,000 men. But when they find the Battle of Kynaskephalae and the Battle of Pydna, the Hellenistic phalanx is up to 16,000 men. And some battles, it's even larger again. It's not a formation that is based on missile warfare. It's a formation that is based on a solid wall of spears and shields and armored infantry that can withstand a lot of damage from your enemy. It's also very hard to get close to. It is maneuverable, but it does unfortunately become less maneuverable under the Hellenistic commanders because they're trying to fight front-on battles with other phalanxes rather than trying to hold a flank while you create a gap to charge into with your cavalry. So anyway, that's part of the stagnation. And when the Romans come along, where their infantry are both heavily armored and armed, but also missile-based infantry, they have an advantage over the Macedonians because they can not only get in amongst the Macedonians with their short gladii and create havoc because the poor old Macedonians are hampered by having to carry a long 20-foot sarissa, but they're also able to launch missiles against the Macedonians and the Hellenistic phalanxes. So that's a massive advantage to the Romans. And of course, the focus then becomes more on the infantry battle than the cavalry battle. What the Hellenistic phalanx has been relying upon is other units to provide its missile fire. And the fascinating thing there, which doesn't really get explored that much, is the fact that the Romans also adopt said same missile infantry. So, for instance, Cretan archers turn up in Hellenistic armies, but then they start turning up in Roman armies too. So the idea of using, mercenary and auxiliary troops to provide a different kind of infantry, light infantry, a missile infantry, is something that is adopted by the Romans after their initial contact with the Hellenistic armies. So that's fascinating in itself. So the cavalry, however, I think maintain their skill and they maintain their superiority of cavalryness, for lack of a better term, but they aren't used correctly and they aren't used to take advantage of a weakness in the enemy line or a weakening in the enemy line. And I think that's probably the biggest issue that occurs. And so therefore what you find is the cavalry is not looking like it's any good anymore simply because it's not being used in the correct way. It's not a deterioration in their quality. It's just a deterioration in their command and their use. Hope that answers your question. We'll see you again next time. Thanks. Bye.